This is AP Calculus Self-Check 7.4 Solutions. Just like Self-Check 7.3, we had no calculator. So for part A, when is the particle moving to the left? So the particle is moving to the left. We don't really know when that happens, but we can tell it potentially happens when this velocity is 0. When it's 0, then it can change direction. Let's see how many times the velocity changes directions by setting this thing equal to 0. So we'll say, I don't want to use blue here. I want to use blue here. So I want to say that cosine of pi over 6t, I need to set that equal to 0. So then we have to ask ourselves, when is cosine 0? So if I look at this, left top bottom or right bottom, when is cosine 0? There's two places.
When it's
the y-axis. So the bottom and the top. Thank you, Joy. So what are those positions in radians? What are these two positions in radians? Careful.
pi over 2.
Pi over 2 and
3 pi over 3. 3 pi over 2.
3 pi over 2. Perfect. So we need to find the position where pi over 6t is equal to these 2 points. So you can set this up as two equations. The first equation could be pi over 6t is equal to pi over 2, and pi over 6t is equal to 3 pi over 2. If you solve these, again using our little trick, if I divide both sides by pi over 6, you're really doing pi over 2 divided by pi over 6, and then you keep it, change it, flip it, so it's going to be pi over 2 times 6 over pi, and this is going to be 3. So in this one, t is equal to 3, and if you do the same thing over here, t is equal to 9.
Keep it, change it, flip it?
Keep it, change it, flip it, yep.
I knew that, just not in that.
So this is the time where we have velocity equal to 0. But where is velocity going to the left? So that's where velocity is negative or positive. What is it, girls? So velocity is positive or negative when the particle is moving to the left?
Negative.
Negative. So I have to ask myself, where is negative on this graph up here?
3.
Is it above or is it to the left?
To the left.
To the left. So I need to say anything over here will be negative. So how do I do that as an interval? We know what times give us this value. So time equals 3, I'm right here. At time equals 9, I'm right here. So I need to say between 3 and 9. Not ahead of 3 and not beyond 9.
Wait, how did you get the 3 and 9?
So remember, 3 went with the time that gave us pi over 2, and 9 went with the time that went to 3 pi over 2.
So is it 3 is less than 9 is less than, or 3 is less than t is less than 9?
Exactly. So you'll have, I'm going to write out the sentence. You don't actually need the sentence, but I'm going to say particle moves left for 3 is less than t is less than 9 for that interval. And the reason, you don't need the reason, but I'm going to say because the velocity is less than 0 in that interval. So there are 2 points to get here. The first point is knowing that you need to set this cosine thing, this function, equal to 0. If you set it equal to 0, give yourself 1 point. That's the first step. If you have this interval, 3 and 9, in between there, give yourself plus 1. On to part B. And I have to go a little bit faster because we're running low on time. We only have 7 more minutes. All right, so for part B, we don't need to evaluate. We just need to do total distance traveled. So for total distance traveled, that means that we are doing absolute value or non-absolute value. Yep, so it's going to be integral between 0 and 6 of the absolute value of velocity of t, dt.
That's it?
That's it.
Wait,
What if I
put the absolute value of cos of pi over 6?
Oh yeah, that's fine too.
Okay.
If you wrote out what vt actually is, that's fine. So that's just 1 point. All right. Part C, find the acceleration. And then we have to determine if the speed is increasing or decreasing or neither. So speed, we know that's going to be comparing velocity and acceleration. And acceleration, just finding that is also going to be a little bit of a challenge. So we know what our velocity t, what vt was. Vt is cosine pi over 6t. So in order to find acceleration, am I doing the integral or am I doing derivative? Derivative. So derivative, remember that we had vt, I'm going to rewrite it out here. Vt used to equal cosine of pi over 6t.
No, pi over 6.
Pi over 6t, right?
Yeah, 6.
Okay. So that means acceleration
6t.
is going to be, this is just chain rule. This is just doing dinner and doubter. So dinner, or sorry, doubter, then dinner. So doubter is going to be what?
Negative 6.
Negative sine of pi over 6t, and then dinner,
Or pi over 6.
pi over 6.
Oh.
That's 1 point right there. 1 point if you're able to get that function. And then now I need to compare velocity and acceleration, and that part is a little bit difficult. So I need to find, let's deal with acceleration. That's the hardest part.
How'd you get a negative there?
So change, C stands for change, so that's where the negative came from.
But I thought it was changed, so C.
Anti-change,
Oh.
when we're doing antiderivative.
Anti and
When I'm doing the normal derivative, there's no anti.
tax.
Yep. Okay, good question. So I need to find the acceleration at 4. So I need to plug in 4, and I'll get negative sine of 2/3 pi times pi over 6. Did we follow that little step that I skipped?
Yeah.
All right. So 2/3 pi, where does that live? And this one is a little bit hard to visualize. I'm going to do it down here. So we know pi lives right here. So 2/3 pi is right about there.
Yeah, which really gets me because I was took 15 minutes trying to figure out where it was and I got it wrong anyway.
You just have to memorize 2/3 pi.
The one on the bottom? Yeah, I thought it was.
So this is 1/2 and square root of 3 over 2.
The one on the bottom is 3 pi over 2.
By the way, this is a negative 1/2.
Damn it, that's what
I
was
based
on.
so much on that. God dang it.
Okay, so this is negative 1/2. That's for cosine. We don't need cosine. We need sine. Sine is the y direction, so it's square root of 3 over 2. So this is going to be,
So stupid.
there's the negative sign copied down, and it's going to be square root of 3 over 2 times this thing, pi over 6. And that's going to equal negative pi square root of 3 over 12. And all we really need to know is that it's negative. We don't actually need to evaluate this. Now we need to do the velocity at time 4. So the velocity was this thing, so that's going to be equal to cosine. When I plug in 4, this is going to be, again, 2/3 pi. Using this same triangle, and I know that cosine now, I'm talking about the x direction, that's going to be a negative 1/2. Negative 1/2. The main thing to take away is it's a negative and a negative. So here's your conclusion. Speed is increasing or decreasing, girls?
I got increasing because it's negative?
Oh,
Because they have same signs.
well, I got speed is increasing, but I got that one was positive and one was negative. So
I got very wrong. So,
because
All right, so this is how you're going to score it. If you said speed increasing, give yourself +1. If you gave the reason because acceleration and velocity have the same sign, give yourself +1. You need to have that explanation.
I had that speed is increasing.
I think you'll still get a point there. Questions about how to score? Yes.
How do you know if it's increasing or decreasing again?
So increasing, can someone else answer that?
so when it's increasing, both velocity and acceleration have the same signs, which means they can either both be negative or both be positive. They're decreasing if velocity has negative and acceleration has positive, or the opposite. So when they're opposite.
Well said.
Okay.
All right, on to part D. We need to find the position of the particle at time equals 4. We only have 2 minutes. I don't know if we're going to be able to finish this. Let's go really quick. So position means I'm going backwards. I'm taking the antiderivative. And I'm really doing start plus change to get the end. Okay,
What?
where did we start? We started at x equals -2.
I did that totally wrong.
And then what is the change? The change is going to be the integral between 0 and 4 of our velocity function. Our velocity function is cosine of pi over 6t. Okay, we need to actually find this integral. So if I do the derivative of the inner, that's not 1. That means I'm using taxman. So u is equal to pi over 6t. Taxman, I'm just going to say tax is equal to nothing. It's 1. And then u prime, we're going to say that's going to be pi over 6. When I treat this as a fraction, 1 divided by pi over 6, that's the same thing as the reciprocal of pi over 6, so this is going to equal 6 over pi. I'm going to pay the taxman with 6 over pi, and this is going to be turned into the integral between 0 and 4 of 6 over pi cosine of pi over 6t. And now I'm going to actually take the antiderivative. Antiderivative of cosine is?
Negative sign.
Anti-change is same, so it's the same sign. This is going to be 6 over pi sine of pi over 6t. And now I need to plug in 4 and 0, so 0 and 4. So when I plug in 4, I'm going to be left with 6 over pi. Technically, I can factor out that 6 over pi. That's a quick little trick. So I'm really doing sine of pi over 6. So I don't know what's going on there. It should be all of this in terms of t. So sine of, that's going to be, when I plug in 4, it's going to be 2/3. Sine of pi of 2 pi over 3. And I'm going to subtract sine of 0. All right, so sine of 2 pi over 3, we have 2 pi over 3 over here. Sine of that is square root of 3 over 2. So this is going to be 6 over pi times square root of 3 over 2. And I'm going to subtract sine of 0. Sine of 0 is right here. The y position is 0. So square root of 3 over 2 minus 0 is going to be square root of 3 over 2. And then I multiply that by 6 over pi. And I'm left with 3 square root of 3 over pi. That is the position at time equals 4. And the way that you score this thing.
What's the one that's the derivative of velocity?
Derivative of velocity.
Antiderivative of velocity?
Antiderivative is total position change.
Total position.
All right, and how to score this really quick, because we just ran out of time 53 seconds ago. Antiderivative, if you have the antiderivative right here, that's plus 1. If you have the initial condition, that's plus 1. And if you have the answer of 3 square root of 3 over pi, that is also plus 1. And that concludes self-check 7.4. Oh, and that is actually incorrect. This should be, we forgot the initial condition. So this needs to, the final answer should really be negative 2 plus 3 square root of 3 divided by pi. Not this one.